On October 15th, 1978, two men desperate for quick money embarked on a journey that would change their lives forever. Patrick Randolph, a 32-year-old unemployed man, and his friend Gilbert Holloway, 29, decided to explore a set of abandoned warehouses on the outskirts of Millville, New Jersey, after receiving a tip from Patrick's mother-in-law about valuable materials supposedly hidden there. What they found, however, was far beyond their comprehension, a primal terror that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. This is Patrick's account, told by him, of the events of that fateful night and the terrible consequences that followed. I should have never trusted her. My mother-in-law, Isabel, was always a manipulative woman, but I was too desperate to see past her sweet words that day. It was a gray autumn Wednesday when she called me over for coffee at her house in Millville. "Patrick, dear," she said, her honeyed voice hiding something I couldn't quite decipher. "I heard about an opportunity that might solve your financial troubles." I leaned in, interested. Carol, my wife, was pregnant with our first child, and the bills kept piling up. I'd lost my job at the local factory 3 months earlier and was scraping by with odd jobs. The idea of a big break was irresistible. Isabel lowered her voice, as if she were sharing a valuable secret. "There's a set of abandoned warehouses about 20 miles from here, near the old state highway. They say the government used them during the war. My late husband used to talk about valuable materials left behind, rare metals, old equipment, things worth a fortune in the right market." My eyes lit up at the thought. "And no one's ever gone to get it?" I asked, skeptical. She shrugged, a mysterious smile playing on her lips. "The place has a bad reputation, stories of accidents, disappearances. But those are just urban legends, I'm sure. A brave man like you wouldn't be scared of such nonsense, would you?" I swallowed hard but nodded. Desperation does strange things to a man's mind. "Of course not. Thanks for the tip, Isabel. I'll check it out." As I left her house, my head was spinning with possibilities. I immediately called Gilbert, my best friend since childhood. He was as desperate as I was, working temporary jobs and struggling to support his family. "Gilbert, buddy, I've got a proposal for you," I said as soon as he picked up. "How about a little urban exploration this weekend? There could be something valuable in it." There was a pause on the other end. "Patrick, you know I don't like doing anything illegal, but how much are we talking?" I grinned. Gilbert was always the cautious one, but I knew he couldn't resist the temptation. "Enough to change our lives, my friend. Enough to give our kids the future they deserve." After a little more convincing, Gilbert reluctantly agreed. We planned to meet on Saturday night under the cover of darkness. Little did we know that night in October would change everything. The next 48 hours would turn into a nightmare that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. If I could go back, I would have ignored Isabel and her empty promises. But desperation and greed are powerful motivators, and they led us straight into the jaws of hell. On Saturday, October 18th, 1978, at 8:37 p.m., Gilbert and I met at the agreed location, an abandoned gas station on the old State Highway 49. The sky was overcast with no moon or stars to light our way. A cold wind blew, making the trees along the road groan and twist like tortured spirits. Gilbert arrived in his old 1972 Chevrolet Nova, the engine rumbling loudly in the silent night. He cut the engine and stepped out, his face a mask of apprehension. "Patrick, are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I've got a bad feeling." I forced a confident smile, ignoring the knot tightening in my own stomach. "Relax, man. We'll just take a quick look and get out. If we find something valuable, great. If not, at least we'll have a story to tell." Gilbert nodded reluctantly, and we grabbed our backpacks from the car. Flashlights, ropes, some basic tools. We thought we were prepared for anything. We had no idea. We walked along a barely visible trail that led away from the main road. The air grew thicker as we went, carrying a strange smell. A mix of rusted metal, mold, and something else we couldn't quite place. Something that made our instincts scream in warning. After about half an hour of walking, we reached a clearing. There, looming out of the mist like a sleeping monster, were the warehouses. 5 massive structures, their dark outlines stark against the night sky. The corrugated metal walls were covered in rust and overgrown vegetation, as if nature was slowly reclaiming the place. "My God," Gilbert whispered, his voice barely audible. "This place is huge. How have we never heard of it before?" I had no answer. The vastness and abandonment of the complex were unsettling. How could something like this have been forgotten for so long? We approached the first warehouse, our flashlights casting shaky beams of light over the structure. A faded sign was still visible above the main entrance. "Federal Depot. Restricted access." "Well, your mother-in-law was right about one thing," Gilbert commented. "This was definitely government property." We tried the main door, but it was chained shut with a thick, rusted padlock. Circling the building, we looked for another way in, and that's when we noticed something strange. On the back wall of the warehouse, there was a series of marks on the metal. At first glance, they seemed like random scratches, but upon closer inspection, we realized they formed a pattern. Symbols, dozens of them, carved deep into the metal. "Gilbert, come take a look at this," I called, my voice betraying my unease. He came over, frowning as he examined the symbols. "What the hell is this? It looks like some kind of writing, but it's nothing I've ever seen." I ran my fingers over the markings, feeling the deep grooves in the metal. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly had the overwhelming sense that we were being watched. "Let's just find a way inside," I said quickly, stepping back from the wall. "The sooner we're in and out, the better." Eventually, we found a broken window about 6 feet off the ground. With some effort, we cleared away the remaining shards of glass and hoisted ourselves inside. The interior of the warehouse was a vast, cavernous space filled with dancing shadows cast by our flashlights. Row upon row of shelves stretched as far as the light could reach, most of them empty, but some still holding boxes and equipment all covered in dust. "Check this out," Gilbert said, his voice echoing strangely in the empty space. He pointed to a nearby box. "Looks like there's something in here." We approached the box, our hearts pounding with the prospect of having found something valuable. But when Gilbert lifted the lid, what we saw made us recoil in shock. Inside was what appeared to be a human skull, but it was deformed in a way that was impossible. It was elongated and distorted with bone protrusions that didn't belong in any known anatomy. "What the hell is that?" Gilbert yelled, letting the lid drop back into place with a loud thud. Before I could respond, a sound echoed through the warehouse, a metallic scraping noise like something heavy being dragged across the floor. And then, in the silence that followed, we heard something that made our blood run cold, a long, hissing breath from deep within the warehouse. And then, footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps getting closer. "Patrick," Gilbert whispered, his face pale with terror. "I don't think we're alone here." The footsteps echoed through the warehouse, growing closer with each passing second. Gilbert and I exchanged terrified glances, frozen in place. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation for what we were hearing. Maybe it was just the wind, or some animal that had made its home in the abandoned building. But deep down, I knew it was something much worse. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, barely able to speak. Gilbert nodded frantically, his eyes wide with fear. We started moving toward the window we had entered through, trying to make as little noise as possible. But in the oppressive silence of the warehouse, every step we took sounded like thunder. We were only a few feet from the window when I heard Gilbert stifle a gasp. I turned, and in the flickering light of our flashlights, I saw something that defied all logic and reason. It was a creature, if you could even call it that. It stood over 7 feet tall, its body a mass of pale, bloated flesh. Where there should have been a face, there was only a gaping, tooth-filled maw. And its eyes. Dear God, its eyes were black, bottomless voids, locked on us with a hunger that was both ancient and endless. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Gilbert toward the window. We ran like we'd never run before, terror giving wings to our feet. Behind us, we heard a roar that didn't belong in this world, a sound that made every fiber of my being scream in fear. Gilbert reached the window first, throwing himself through it with a desperate strength. I followed, feeling sharp claws graze my back as I hurled myself outside. We hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from our lungs, but there was no time to catch our breath. We scrambled to our feet and bolted for the forest, not daring to look back. The sounds of pursuit followed us. Branches snapping, guttural growls, and something else. A noise like metal scraping against metal, a sound that made my teeth ache and my head throb. We ran blindly through the darkness, tripping over roots and slamming into trees. Fear drove us, obliterating all thoughts of pain or exhaustion. At some point, I realized I could no longer hear Gilbert's footsteps beside me. "Gilbert!" I shouted, stopping and spinning around frantically. "Gilbert, where are you?" Silence. Only the sound of my ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. And then, from somewhere to my right, I heard a scream. Gilbert's scream. Every part of me wanted to run the other way, to flee this nightmare and never look back, but I couldn't leave my friend. With trembling legs, I forced myself to move toward the sound. I found Gilbert in a small clearing. He was lying on his back, his eyes wide and staring at the night sky. And over him. My mind refuses to fully describe what I saw. It was like a giant ball of flesh, covered in eyes and mouths. Enormous teeth gnawed noisily as it fed on Gilbert's body. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My muscles locked, unable to move as I watched the horrific scene unfold. Then the creature noticed me. Every one of its eyes turned toward me, and I felt its gaze hit me like a physical blow. One of its mouths opened, not to feed, but to speak. "Welcome, Patrick Randolph," the thing said, its voice a cacophony of whispers and screams. "We've been waiting for you." At that moment, something inside me broke. With a scream that tore at my throat, I turned and ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, driven by a terror that transcended everything I had ever known. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that at some point I stumbled and fell, rolling down a steep embankment. My head struck something hard, and the darkness swallowed me. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of a road. The sun was rising on the horizon, its cold light shining on a world that seemed terribly normal after the horrors of the night before. My body ached, covered in cuts and bruises, and my mind was still clouded by shock. For a brief moment, I let myself believe it had all been a terrible nightmare. But then I saw the marks on my hands. Strange symbols identical to the ones we had seen at the warehouse, now etched into my flesh as if they had been burned there. The reality of what had happened hit me like a sledgehammer. Gilbert was dead. I had abandoned my best friend to die in a horrific and unimaginable way. And those creatures, those things that shouldn't exist. Staggering, I managed to make it to the main highway. A compassionate truck driver stopped and gave me a ride back to Millville. I must have looked like a madman to him, mumbling incoherently about monsters and cursed warehouses. When I finally got home, Carol rushed to embrace me, tears streaming down her face. Apparently, I had been missing for 3 whole days. 3 days. To me, it felt like only a single night had passed in that hell. "Patrick, where were you? What happened?" Carol asked between sobs. "The police had been looking for you and Gilbert for days." I didn't know what to say. How could I explain the unexplainable? How could I tell her that her best friend, the godfather of our unborn child, had been devoured by a monster from the worst of nightmares? I don't know," I stammered. "We got lost in the woods. Gilbert didn't make it out." The days that followed were a blur of police interrogations, fruitless searches, and suspicious looks. I told an edited version of what had happened. That Gilbert and I had gone to explore the old warehouses in search of valuable items, that we got lost in the woods, and that at some point, we got separated. I left out any mention of the creatures or the supernatural events. Who would believe me? The police combed the area but found no sign of Gilbert or the horrors we had witnessed. The warehouses were there, of course, abandoned and empty as they had always been. But there were no deformed skulls, no strange symbols on the walls. It was as if the night of October 18th had never happened. I became the prime suspect in Gilbert's disappearance. After all, I was the last person to see him alive, and my story had gaping holes that I couldn't, or wouldn't, fill. Only the lack of concrete evidence kept me out of jail. But the real punishment came in other forms. Carol, unable to cope with the situation and increasingly doubting my sanity, left me a few weeks later. taking our unborn child with her. I lost my job, my friends distanced themselves, and soon I found myself alone, haunted by nightmares and memories I couldn't share. That's when I started noticing the changes. It began with small things, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, whispers in the silence of the night, but soon it became more intense. The symbols on my hands started to glow with a sickly light when darkness fell. And sometimes when I looked in the mirror, I swore I saw something else staring back through my own eyes. Desperate for answers, I turned my attention back to the events of that fateful night. I spent hours at the local library researching the warehouses, ancient symbols, and folklore creatures. What I found chilled me to the bone. The warehouses had a far darker history than I could have imagined. Built during World War II, they weren't simple storage depots, but secret research facilities. The government had gathered scientists and occultists in a desperate attempt to create weapons that could turn the tide of the war. But they had meddled with forces far beyond their understanding. In 1944, something went horribly wrong. An experiment spiraled out of control, opening a portal to somewhere else, a place of darkness and unimaginable horror. The entire complex was sealed, the records destroyed, and the location erased from all official maps. But the evil that had been unleashed that day couldn't simply be locked away and forgotten. It waited, grew, fed on the fears and nightmares of those who ventured too close. And now, after decades, it had found a new connection to our world, through me. I realized with growing horror that I was no longer fully human. Whatever had happened that night had changed me in ways I was still discovering, and worse, I had become a conduit for something far, far worse. I write this account now as both a warning and a confession. I can feel my humanity slipping away with each passing day. The voices are getting louder, the visions more vivid. I know that soon I won't be myself anymore. To whoever finds this, don't repeat my mistakes. Don't let greed or desperation blind you to the dangers lurking in the shadows. And if you ever come across abandoned warehouses in the forest of New Jersey, run, and don't look back. As for me, I will do what I can to contain the evil I inadvertently helped unleash. I will return to that cursed place one last time to try and seal the portal once and for all. If I succeed, perhaps I can redeem myself for Gilbert's death and the danger I brought into this world. If I fail, may God have mercy on our souls. Patrick Randolph, December 22nd, 1978, Millville, New Jersey.